Dawn broke over Fort Braxton with military precision, sunlight spilling across the grounds in orderly formation. The base came alive with the sound of boots on asphalt, vehicles humming to life, and distant cadence calls from morning PT. American. Flags snapped in the breeze, rising up flagpoles across the installation as another day began. Rebecca Carter moved through this carefully choreographed routine, like a ghost both part of and separate from the military world around her. At 52, she carried herself with the straight-backed posture that had been drilled into her decades ago, though her right leg dragged slightly with each step, a private reminder of costs paid long ago. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her expression neutral as she approached the base commissary. The sliding doors parted with a mechanical sigh. Rebecca adjusted the collar of her faded olive-green military jacket, a relic from another lifetime. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and the color had long since faded from olive to something closer to khaki in places. She wore it not out of necessity, but from habit and private remembrance. The morning air had carried a chill, and the jacket was the first thing she had reached for. Inside, the commissary bustled with the morning crowd. Young families pushed carts down aisles, retired veterans congregated by the coffee station, and uniformed personnel grabbed breakfast sandwiches and energy drinks on their way to duty. Rebecca picked up a red shopping basket and moved deliberately through the store, consulting a neatly folded list from her pocket. She paused in the canned goods section, comparing prices with careful attention. Her fingers marked by a surgical scar across the right wrist traced over the labels of soup cans, calculating the best value. Money was tighter these days. The VA benefits that should have sustained her had become entangled in bureaucratic questions about service records that officially did not exist. Two young lieutenants in pressed uniforms rounded the corner into her aisle, their conversation cutting through her concentration. "Did you see the new equipment allocation for field training?" asked the taller one, his lieutenant bars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Not yet, but Miller says it's the same shortage as last quarter," his companion replied, then stopped, short as he noticed Rebecca. His eyes flicked to her jacket, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Speaking of shortages, Rebecca continued examining soup cans, her expression unchanged, though her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Must have raided her grandfather's closet," the taller lieutenant said with a smirk. "That thing looks like it survived World War II. More like Vietnam," the other replied. "Probably found it at the thrift store on discount day." Rebecca selected 2 cans of soup and placed them in her basket, then moved down the aisle toward the pasta section. The lieutenants followed, their morning errands apparently forgotten in favor of this new entertainment. As she reached for a box of spaghetti on a high shelf, her jacket sleeve rolled up, revealing more of the surgical scar on her wrist. The movement also caused her to wince slightly, her right shoulder protesting the stretch. The physical therapist had warned her that full range of motion might never return, but Rebecca had learned to work around limitations long ago. "Think that's from actual service," the shorter lieutenant whispered, not quite quietly enough, or just trying to look the part? Hard to tell these days. "Remember that guy last month claiming special forces when he couldn't even name the selection process?" his companion added with a knowing look. Rebecca's hand closed around the pasta box, her knuckles whitening briefly before she placed it in her basket. She reached into her inner jacket pocket for her grocery list, and as she did, a faded photograph slipped partially into view before being tucked away again. Only Rebecca knew it showed 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, faces partially obscured by shadows and tactical gear, standing beside a helicopter with markings that had been deliberately obscured before the photo was developed. The weight of that photograph and the memories it carried pressed against her chest as she continued through the commissary. 22 years had passed since that night in the Iranian desert, but the ghost of stitching above her heart, where a unit patch had once been clearly visible, served as a constant reminder. Now only those who knew exactly what to look for might recognize the faded outline of what had once been there. Behind her, the lieutenant's commentary grew bolder, emboldened by her continued silence. But Rebecca had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not in the way people expected. She had survived classified missions that officially never happened, carrying secrets that could never be shared and scars that could never be explained. What the young officers didn't know was that her silence carried the weight of operations no one was allowed to remember, and that the worn jacket they mocked had once belonged to a hero who hadn't made it home. Rebecca continued through the commissary, adding items to her basket, while the lieutenants maintained their casual pursuit, their comments growing incrementally bolder as they noted her continued silence. When she stopped at the dairy case, a small group of enlisted personnel entered, laughing among themselves. One of the specialists recognized the lieutenants and offered a quick salute. "Morning, sirs." "At ease." The taller lieutenant, whose name tag read Davidson, said with a wave. "Early shopping run?" "Yes, sir. Brigade coffee mess needed restocking." Lieutenant Davidson nodded toward Rebecca with barely concealed amusement. "What do you think of that vintage fashion statement?" The specialist glanced at Rebecca's jacket, taking in the faded fabric and worn edges. He grinned, clearly sensing the direction his superior wanted the conversation to go. "Very retro, sir. Almost authentic looking." "Almost being the key word," Davidson said, loud enough now that several other shoppers glanced their way. Rebecca closed the dairy case door, a carton of eggs now in her basket. She turned toward the checkout lanes, limping slightly as she changed direction. Long hours standing always aggravated the old injury, though she'd learned to disguise the weakness when necessary. "Classic stolen valor prep," the shorter Lieutenant Johnson said, no longer bothering to lower his voice. "Bet she's heading to the VA next to try for benefits." Rebecca's destination was indeed the VA office on the other side of the base, though not for the reasons they assumed. The quarterly appeal of her case was scheduled for 11 o'clock, another attempt to have her service records partially unsealed so her medical claims could be processed. 3 previous attempts had ended with apologetic rejections from administrators, who could not acknowledge operations that officially never happened. As she approached the checkout, the cashier, a retired master sergeant, judging by the veteran's cap he wore, noticed her jacket. His eyes lingered for a moment on the faded area above the left breast pocket, where a unit patch had once been clearly visible. Now only the ghost of stitching remained, the embroidery worn away by years until only those who knew exactly what to look for might recognize it. The cashier said nothing, simply scanning her items with practiced efficiency. Rebecca paid in cash, counting out bills carefully from a thin wallet. "Have a good day, ma'am," the cashier said as he handed her the receipt. "You too," Rebecca replied, her voice slightly husky from disuse. They were the first words she had spoken aloud all morning. With her purchases bagged, Rebecca headed toward customer service. The quarterly VA appeal required her to verify her address on base, a formality that never seemed to make it permanently into their system. Behind her, she could hear the lieutenants had finished their own shopping and were now in line a few registers away. The customer service line moved slowly. Rebecca stood patiently, weight shifted to her left leg to ease the pressure on her right. Her mind drifted as she waited, carried back 22 years to another desert morning, the air filled with grit and the smell of aviation fuel. "Captain Carter, extraction window is closing." The voice of her team leader came to her across the decades. "We either go now or we don't go at all." The memory dissolved as the customer service representative called next. Rebecca stepped forward to the counter, where a young woman with a name tag reading Amanda smiled professionally. "How can I help you today?" Amanda asked. "I need to verify my current address for base records," Rebecca said, sliding her ID toward the clerk. "Of course," Amanda said, typing the information into her computer. "Are you active duty or a dependent?" "Veteran," Rebecca answered. "I'll need to see your veteran ID card or DD-214, please." Rebecca knew this would happen, just as it happened every 3 months. "My service records are under special classification. I have a letter from the Department of Defense Records Office." She produced a folder containing several official-looking documents. Amanda looked uncertain, clearly not trained for this exception. "I'm sorry, but we need standard documentation. Let me call my supervisor." Behind her, Rebecca could hear the lieutenants had finished checking out and were now standing nearby, watching the exchange with obvious interest. "Some people will claim anything for a 10% discount," Davidson said, just loud enough to carry to those nearby. Several people chuckled, including one of the customer service representatives at the next counter over. The supervisor arrived, a middle-aged woman with an efficient manner. She examined Rebecca's paperwork with a frown. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but these documents don't meet our requirements for veteran status verification. We need standard documentation. These are the only documents I'm authorized to carry," Rebecca explained, her voice remaining even despite the familiar frustration building behind her calm facade. "Then I can't update your information in our system," the supervisor said apologetically. "You'll need to contact the VA directly." "That's why I'm here," Rebecca said. "The VA sent me to verify my address with base records before my appointment." The bureaucratic circle was one she had walked many times before. Her service with Phantom Unit remained classified at a level that prevented normal documentation. Yet the injuries she had sustained required ongoing medical care. Each denial added another layer of frustration to a process that seemed designed to make her give up. Behind her, the lieutenants had drawn a small crowd with their commentary. "Classic case," Johnson was saying to an interested specialist. "Where?" "Something that looks military enough to pass a quick glance. Make up some story about classified operations so no one can verify anything. People who do that should be prosecuted," the specialist agreed, casting a judgmental glance toward Rebecca. The supervisor handed back Rebecca's folder. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. You might try the main administration building instead." Rebecca accepted the folder, tucking it into her jacket's inner pocket. As she did, the edge of a challenge coin briefly became visible, not the mass-produced variety sold in base gift shops, but a rare, specialized design given only to members of units whose existence remained classified. "Thank you for your time," Rebecca said quietly. She collected her groceries and turned to leave, finding herself facing the small crowd that had gathered. The expressions ranged from outright mockery from the lieutenants to uncomfortable embarrassment from those who sensed they might be witnessing something they didn't fully understand. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, the ingrained military bearing asserting itself automatically. She walked toward the exit, maintaining her dignity despite the whispers that followed her. The automatic doors slid open ahead, revealing the bright morning sunlight beyond. What none of them realized was that in exactly 3 minutes, everything would change. The automatic doors slid open, and Rebecca found herself face to face with another uniform, this one adorned with 4 stars. General Marcus Thompson entered the commissary, flanked by 2 aides, his attention focused on a document in his hands. He was a tall man with close-cropped silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in command. "I want those deployment numbers recalculated by this afternoon," he was saying to the aide on his right. "The committee needs accurate projections, not best-case scenarios." "Yes, sir," the aide replied, making a note on his tablet. Rebecca automatically shifted to the side to let them pass, tucking her grocery bags closer to her body, her eyes downcast. In the instinctive deference civilians often adopt around high-ranking officers, she had nearly cleared their path when General Thompson glanced up from his document, his eyes passing over her in the casual assessment of a security-conscious officer. Then he stopped. His body went rigid, the document in his hand forgotten. As his gaze locked onto the nearly invisible patch above Rebecca's heart, it was nothing more than a shadow on the fabric now, the embroidery worn away until only the faintest outline remained, a ghost of stitches that had once formed a symbol known to very few. The general's aides continued 2 steps before realizing their commanding officer had stopped. They turned, confused expressions giving way to concern as they observed the general's reaction. The commissary's ambient noise seemed to dim as General Thompson handed his document to the nearest aide without taking his eyes off Rebecca. Then, with precision that came from decades of service, he snapped to attention and rendered a perfect, formal salute. Rebecca froze, her grocery bag suddenly heavy in her hands. The salute in civilian settings was against protocol. The recognition it represented was unprecedented. The moment stretched, the general's salute unwavering. Around them, conversations died as military personnel noticed the extraordinary scene unfolding. The lieutenants who had been mocking Rebecca moments earlier fell silent, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. With practiced muscle memory that transcended the years, Rebecca carefully transferred her grocery bags to her left hand and returned the salute with perfect military precision, her movements transforming from the cautious motions of a civilian to the crisp certainty of a soldier. "Captain Carter," General Thompson said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "Phantom Unit, Operation Sandstorm, 2003. It was both a statement and a question, an acknowledgement and a verification. 22 years collapsed between them, compressing time until that night in the Iranian desert felt as immediate as yesterday. "Yes, sir," Rebecca confirmed, her voice stronger now. The general lowered his salute, and Rebecca followed suit. The commissary had gone completely still, all attention focused on the unexpected exchange between a 4-star general and a woman in a worn military jacket. "At ease, Captain," the general said, though Rebecca held no official rank anymore. "Thank you, sir," she replied, decades of military discipline guiding her response. General Thompson dismissed his aides with a short gesture. "Wait for me outside." His tone made it clear this was not a request to be questioned. The aides exchanged glances but promptly headed for the exit, leaving the general alone with Rebecca in the midst of the growing crowd of onlookers. "It was your unit that got us out," the general said, his voice quieter now but still clear enough for those nearby to hear. 3 helicopters down, hostiles on all sides. Your team created the extraction corridor that saved 32 of us, including myself." Rebecca nodded once, the memories she usually kept carefully contained now surging to the surface. The night operation, the sandstorm that had grounded 3 extraction helicopters, the diplomatic team and their military escorts, trapped as Iranian Revolutionary Guard units closed in. The impossible choices made by her 6-person team to create an escape route. "That insignia," the general continued, gesturing to the faded area on her jacket, "hasn't been authorized for wear since the unit was disbanded. Official records list. The extraction as equipment malfunction recovery. Successful." The crowd began to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary, a classified operation being acknowledged in public for perhaps the first time. The lieutenants who had been mocking Rebecca stood frozen, their faces draining of color as the implications of their earlier behavior became clear. "How many of you made it home from that operation, Captain?" the general asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. 3 of us, sir," Rebecca said softly. "I'm the last one now." General Thompson absorbed this information with a slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible sign of emotion. "Would you join me for coffee, Captain?" He gestured toward the small cafe area in the corner of the commissary. "Of course, sir," Rebecca replied. As they moved toward the cafe, the crowd parted silently, respect and curiosity mingling in the wake of the revelation. The lieutenants stood rooted to the spot, mortification evident in their rigid postures. Behind them, whispers began to spread through the commissary like wildfire. The woman they had dismissed as a fraud was someone whose service had saved lives, including that of a 4-star general. The worn jacket they had mocked was a memorial to fallen heroes. And Rebecca Carter, who had carried her secrets in silence for over 2 decades, was finally being recognized for the warrior she had always been. The real reckoning, however, was just beginning. The general and Rebecca settled at a small table. In the corner, away from most of the onlookers, a young airman working at the cafe counter rushed over to take their order, clearly flustered by the general's presence. "Just coffee, black," the general said. "The same," Rebecca added. When the airman retreated, General Thompson leaned forward. "I've often wondered what happened to your team after the debriefing. Everything went into classified files so deep, even I couldn't access them anymore." "That was by design, sir," Rebecca sighed. "Phantom unit operated under triple-blind protocols. Mission parameters, team composition, even our existence was compartmentalized. For good reason," the general acknowledged. "That operation prevented a diplomatic catastrophe that could have led to open war." The airmen returned with their coffees, setting them down with nervous care before retreating. The general waited until they were alone again before continuing. "What brings you to Fort Braxton, Captain? Last intelligence placed you retired in Colorado." "Medical appeal, sir," Rebecca answered, her professional demeanor hiding the frustration of countless rejected claims. "I've been trying to get the VA to recognize injuries sustained during operations," she continued, without being able to reference the operations themselves. "The catch-22 of the highest order," the general concluded, understanding immediately. "Yes, sir. My right leg and shoulder were damaged during the sandstorm extraction. The medical records exist, but they're classified at a level the VA administrators can't access." General Thompson's expression hardened. "That ends today." He pulled out his phone and dialed with quick, decisive movements. "This is General Thompson. I need immediate action on a personnel matter." He paused, listening. "Yes, that level of clearance. My authorization code is Sierra 9 Delta 40 Tango." Another pause as he listened to the response. "I need everything we have on Phantom Unit declassified immediately, specifically relating to personnel injuries sustained during Operation Sandstorm. 2003. Priority Directive." He listened once more. "Yes, I understand the protocols." "Override them. This is a direct order." He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket, his gaze meeting Rebecca's. "Bureaucracy moves slowly, especially when it comes to declassification, but my office will expedite everything they can. Your service will not continue to go unrecognized, Captain." "Thank you, sir," Rebecca said, her composure maintained despite the surge of emotion his words triggered. After years of fighting the system alone, the simple act of recognition felt almost overwhelming. Their conversation was interrupted as the 2 lieutenants approached the table, their earlier confidence replaced by evident discomfort. They stopped at a respectful distance, coming to attention before the general. "Sir, request permission to speak," Davidson said, his voice tightly controlled. General Thompson glanced at Rebecca, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small nod. "Granted," the general said. Davidson turned to Rebecca. "Ma'am, I wish to apologize for my extremely inappropriate and disrespectful behavior. There is no excuse for how we spoke to you or about you." Johnson joined in. "We acted shamefully, ma'am." We failed to uphold the values of the officer corps and the respect owed to all service members, especially those who served in classified operations. Rebecca studied them for a moment, seeing beyond their current embarrassment to the officers they might become. You couldn't have known, she said finally. That was the point of units like mine. We operated in shadow so others could work in the light. That doesn't excuse our behavior, Davidson said. We judged based on appearances, not understanding what we were seeing. A lesson worth learning early in your careers, General Thompson observed, his tone making it clear that while the apology was accepted, the incident would not be forgotten. Yes, sir, both lieutenants replied in unison. Return to your duties. The general dismissed them. As the lieutenants departed, word of what had transpired had clearly spread through the commissary. Veterans began approaching the table, not interrupting, but offering quiet nods of respect or simple acknowledgments as they passed. The atmosphere had transformed from one of mockery to profound respect. Your jacket, General Thompson said, returning to their conversation. It's not standard issue for Phantom Unit. I remember your team wore modified multicam patterns. Rebecca ran her fingers over the worn fabric, a gesture filled with memory. It belonged to Major Callahan, our unit commander. He didn't make it back from Sandstorm. I've kept it all these years. The general nodded, understanding the weight of carrying a fallen comrade's memory. Daniel Callahan was one of the finest officers I ever encountered. I was never officially briefed on how he died. Covering our extraction, sir. He held the perimeter alone so the rest of us could get the diplomatic team to the secondary extraction point. His last order was for U.S. not to come back for him. And you've carried his jacket ever since, the general observed. It was all that made it back, besides his dog tags, Rebecca confirmed. Those went to his family, with the official story about a training accident. The jacket came to me since I was his executive officer. General Thompson studied her with newfound understanding. And the patch, I'm surprised you keep it visible at all, given the classification level. Time did that for me, sir, Rebecca said with the ghost of a smile. It's worn away enough that only someone who knew exactly what to look for would recognize it. I've kept the original patch in storage all these years, along with the memories. Some things you don't need physical reminders to remember, the general added. Around them, the commissary had returned to its normal operations, though glances continued to be cast their way. The supervisor from customer service approached cautiously, her earlier bureaucratic certainty replaced by nervous deference. General Thompson, she began, I want to apologize for any inconvenience earlier. If there's anything customer service can do to assist Captain Carter, we would be honored to help. Thank you, the general replied. I believe we'll be resolving Captain Carter's documentation issues at a higher level today. Of course, sir, the supervisor said, retreating quickly. Rebecca watched the interaction with quiet amusement. Amazing how quickly things change when a general takes interest. Rank has its privileges, General Thompson acknowledged. Though in this case, it's simply correcting a long-standing oversight. He checked his watch. I have a meeting in 20 minutes I can't postpone, but I want you to come to my office afterward. We have much to discuss about ensuring you receive the benefits and recognition you're entitled to. That's not necessary, sir, Rebecca began. It absolutely is, the general countered firmly. What your team did saved lives, including mine. The classification was necessary, but allowing that same classification to deny you proper medical care and benefits is unacceptable. Some forms of gratitude shouldn't remain classified. For the first time in 22 years, Rebecca Carter felt the weight of her invisible service beginning to lift. The fight wasn't over. There would be more bureaucracy, more appeals, more battles with the system. But now she wasn't fighting alone. The ghost in olive green was finally being seen. Word spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. By afternoon, the story of the woman in the faded jacket had reached every corner of the base. The details grew. With each telling, but the core remained the same. A decorated veteran had been mocked for wearing the jacket of her fallen commander, only to be recognized and honored by a 4-star general. Rebecca sat in the waiting area outside General Thompson's office, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that came from decades of carrying invisible burdens. The morning's events felt surreal. After so many years of silence, the sudden acknowledgement was almost overwhelming. Captain Carter, a young corporal, approached with respectful deference. "General Thompson will see you now." She entered the office to find the general behind his desk, several manila folders spread before him. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floor. "Please sit." General Thompson gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I've been making calls all afternoon. The wheels are finally turning." He opened one of the folders. "The Department of Defense has agreed to limited declassification of Phantom Unit records. Not operational details, but enough to validate service. Records for benefit purposes. It's unprecedented, but your case presents unique circumstances." Rebecca absorbed this information, hardly daring to believe it. "How long will the process take, sir?" "Normally, years. With my personal involvement and the nature of what you did for our people that night, weeks, possibly days for the initial approval. The full medical review will take longer, but you'll have interim benefits while that's processed." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the careful attention of a career officer. "There's something else. The Army is establishing a new training program for specialized extraction operations. Your experience would be invaluable in developing the curriculum." "Teaching, sir?" Rebecca's voice carried surprise. "Not classroom. Instruction. Field training, scenario development, real-world application of lessons learned. The kind of knowledge that can't be found in manuals." He paused. "Your country could benefit from what you know, Captain. What your team learned the hard way." The offer hung in the air between them. For so long, Rebecca had felt like a relic of operations that officially never happened. The idea of her experience having value beyond her own survival was both appealing and daunting. "I need to think about it, sir." "Of course. There's no rush." General Thompson closed the folder and stood. "But first, let's address the immediate issues. Your medical care, your benefits, your recognition. The rest can wait." As Rebecca left the general's office, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for her own situation, but for the possibility that her team's sacrifice might finally serve a purpose beyond the classified files that contained their story. Meanwhile, across the base, the 2 lieutenants who had started the morning by mocking her were facing their own reckoning. Lieutenant Davidson sat across from his commanding officer, Major Patricia Wells, in the battalion headquarters. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting harsh lines across the major's face as she reviewed the incident report. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Major Wells said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that was far worse than shouting. "You and Lieutenant Johnson spent the better part of an hour publicly mocking a decorated veteran, making assumptions about stolen valor, and encouraging others to join in your little show." "Yes, ma'am," Davidson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "A veteran who, it turns out, served in a classified unit that saved the lives of 32 personnel, including a current 4-star general." She set down the report and fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. "A veteran whose service was so classified that she couldn't defend herself without violating national security protocols. Ma'am, we had no way of knowing." "Stop." The major's voice cut through his excuse like a blade. "You had no way of knowing because you didn't try to know. You saw someone who didn't fit your narrow definition of what a veteran should look like, and you decided to make her the entertainment for your morning. Davidson's face burned with shame. The weight of what they had done, not just the mockery, but the public humiliation of someone who had served with honor, was crushing. What you displayed today was the opposite of every value we claim to. Hold, Major Wells continued. Honor, respect, integrity, you showed none of these. Instead, you demonstrated arrogance, prejudice, and a fundamental lack of understanding about the nature of service. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the base where the story was still spreading. Do you have any idea how this reflects on our unit? On the officer corps? On the entire military? Yes, ma'am, Davidson said, though his voice suggested he was only beginning to grasp the full implications. I doubt that. She turned back to face him. But you're going to learn. Both you and Lieutenant Johnson are hereby assigned to sensitivity training, professional development courses, and community service at the base VA clinic. You'll spend the next month learning about the veterans you chose to mock today. Yes, ma'am. Furthermore, you'll personally apologize to Captain Carter in writing, and you'll participate in a base-wide educational program about respecting all veterans, regardless of how they look or what they wear. The punishment was thorough but fair, designed not just to penalize but to educate. Major Wells was a career officer who understood that good soldiers could make terrible mistakes, but they could also learn from them. One more thing, she added as Davidson prepared to leave. Captain Carter has been offered a position helping to develop new training programs. There's a very good chance she'll be working with junior officers like yourself. I suggest you use this time to reflect on the kind of officer you want to be when that happens. As Davidson left the major's office, he carried with him not just the weight of his punishment, but the heavier burden of understanding. The woman he had humiliated that morning was everything he had claimed to respect about military service: courage, sacrifice, quiet professionalism. His failure to recognize that said more about his own limitations than anything else. The real education was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Carter walked through the same automatic doors of the Fort Braxton commissary, but everything had changed. The morning routine around her remained the same: recruits jogging in formation, flags rising on poles across the base, personnel hurrying to their duty stations. But for Rebecca, the world felt different. She still wore the same faded olive green jacket, but it had been carefully cleaned and preserved. The patch above her heart, once worn to near invisibility, had been restored. The emblem of Phantom Unit was now clearly visible, though subdued. Below it gleamed a small pin representing the Presidential Unit Citation, finally awarded after 20 years of official silence. Rebecca's stride was stronger now, her limp less pronounced. The medical treatments she had been fighting to receive for years had finally begun, courtesy of expedited VA approvals that had appeared mysteriously in the system 2 days after her meeting with General Thompson. Physical therapy was slowly restoring function to her damaged leg and shoulder, though the therapist warned that some limitations would always remain. The commissary was busy with the morning rush, but today Rebecca noticed a difference in how people regarded her. The mocking glances were gone, replaced by nods of recognition or respect. Not everyone knew her story. Most of the details remained classified. But word had spread through the base community that the woman in the faded jacket was someone who had earned her place in military history, even if that history remained partially redacted. The clerk at the customer service counter recognized her immediately. "Good morning, Captain Carter," she called with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Amanda," Rebecca replied, having learned the young woman's name during her now much smoother interactions with base services. As Rebecca selected a shopping basket and began moving through the aisles, she noticed one of the lieutenants from that day 3 weeks ago. Davidson was alone this time, examining canned goods with the serious concentration of someone still learning to manage a household budget on military pay. When he looked up and saw Rebecca, his expression cycled quickly through recognition, embarrassment, and resolve. He approached her with the direct manner officers were taught to use when addressing difficult situations. "Captain Carter," he said, coming to a respectful stop several feet away. "Lieutenant Davidson," Rebecca acknowledged. "I wanted to tell you that your case study is now part of our professional development curriculum," he said. General Thompson personally introduced it to the officer training program. They don't share all the classified details, of course, but they use your story to teach us about making assumptions and respecting those who served before us, especially in ways that aren't obvious from insignia or uniform. Rebecca nodded, accepting this information with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. Good lessons for any officer. "They are, ma'am." The lieutenant hesitated, then added, "I've taken those lessons particularly to heart, given my personal failure in that area." "We all learn from experience, Lieutenant," Rebecca said, her tone softening slightly. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our mistakes." "Yes, ma'am." He straightened his shoulders. "Thank you for your service, Captain." Both then and now. As Davidson moved away, Rebecca continued her shopping with a thoughtful expression. The exchange had been one of many such encounters over the past weeks, as word of her service had spread through official and unofficial channels. General Thompson had been true to his word, starting the process of limited declassification for the Phantom Unit records related to medical treatment and benefits. While most operational details remained highly classified, enough had been made available to validate the service of the surviving team members. For Rebecca, the changes went beyond improved medical care and proper benefits. After years of operating in shadows and then living in the limbo of unacknowledged service, the simple act of recognition had shifted something fundamental in her relationship with her past. She completed her shopping efficiently, selecting items with the same careful attention to value, though financial concerns were less pressing now that her disability benefits had been approved. As she approached the checkout, she noticed the same cashier who had recognized her jacket that first day. "Morning, Captain," he said with a nod to her restored patch. "Good to see that getting the respect it deserves now." "Morning, Master." "Sergeant," she replied, having learned his name and former rank during previous visits. "Things have improved considerably." "About time," he said as he scanned her items. "Some of us suspected what that faded patch might be, but you don't ask about those things unless someone wants to tell you. Appreciate the discretion," Rebecca said. "It's been ingrained for so long, it's still strange having it acknowledged." "I imagine so." He finished bagging her groceries. "My nephew's at the academy now. Says they've started teaching about specialized units and proper protocol. Your unit specifically got mentioned, though not by name or mission details." "Progress," Rebecca agreed, paying for her groceries. As she turned from the checkout, a young female officer approached her, moving with the slightly nervous energy of someone about to speak to a superior they greatly respected. She was perhaps 25, with Lieutenant bars gleaming on her uniform and the focused intensity of the recently commissioned. "Excuse me," the young woman said. "Are you Captain Rebecca Carter from Phantom Unit?" Rebecca assessed the lieutenant with a quick glance, noting the intelligence insignia on her uniform. "I am." The lieutenant came to attention, offering a crisp salute. "Lieutenant Jessica Morgan, ma'am. 103rd Military Intelligence Battalion." Rebecca returned the salute with ingrained precision. "At ease, Lieutenant. How can I help you?" "Ma'am, I've been studying your extraction techniques as part of advanced training. They've incorporated the declassified portions of your Sandstorm operation into the updated field manual." The lieutenant's expression showed genuine admiration. Your innovations in limited resource extraction under hostile conditions have become foundational training. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with hidden accomplishments. I'm glad the lessons we learned the hard way are being passed along. They are, ma'am, Lieutenant Morgan assured her. In fact, I'm part of a training development team working on updated protocols based on your team's methods. She hesitated briefly. I was wondering if you might consider speaking to my platoon sometime. Having insight directly from you would be invaluable. 20 years of instinctive silence warred briefly with the new reality of selective disclosure. Rebecca studied the young officer, seeing in her the same determination and intelligence that had marked the members of her own team so long ago. I'd be happy to speak with your platoon, Rebecca said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Within classification limitations, of course. Lieutenant Morgan's face lit up. That would be incredible, ma'am. The team would benefit tremendously from your experience. They exchanged contact information, and as the lieutenant departed with a final salute, Rebecca found herself contemplating this unexpected turn in her life's path. After decades of shadows, she was stepping cautiously into the light, finding purpose in sharing what could be shared with the next generation. As Rebecca left the commissary, grocery bags in hand, she passed a group of young soldiers who straightened instinctively at the sight of her patch and citation. Their reactions were no longer based on assumptions about a worn jacket, but on recognition of what it represented. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, casting sharp relief across the orderly landscape of Fort Braxton. Rebecca paused for a moment, adjusting to the brightness. A figure approached from the direction of headquarters, and she recognized General Thompson walking with another officer. The general noticed her and altered his course slightly to intercept her path. Captain Carter, he greeted her. Just the person I wanted to see. General, Rebecca acknowledged with a nod. How can I help you, sir? I've been reviewing the progress on the declassification process, he said. There's been a development I think you'll want to hear about. Sir? We've located Specialist Rodriguez's family, the general said, referring to another member of Phantom Unit who hadn't survived. With the partial declassification, we can finally arrange proper recognition for his sacrifice. His daughter will receive his Silver Star next month. Rebecca absorbed this news, thinking of the young communications specialist who had died ensuring their extraction team maintained contact during the operation. His daughter must be in her 20s now. 26, the general confirmed. She grew up believing her father died in a training accident. Now she knows he died a hero even if she can't know all the details. That matters, Rebecca said softly. It matters a great deal. We'd like you to be part of the ceremony, General Thompson continued. As the last surviving team member, your presence would mean a lot to his family. Of course, sir. I'd be honored. The general nodded. Excellent. My aide will send you the details. He gestured to the patch on her jacket. I see you've restored the insignia. Yes, sir. Seemed appropriate now that it's partially acknowledged. It suits you, Captain, the general said. Always did. He checked his watch. I need to get to a briefing, but there's something else I wanted to mention. We're establishing that specialized training program for extraction operations under complex conditions. Your input would be invaluable in designing the curriculum. Teaching was never my specialty, sir, Rebecca said cautiously. Experience is what we need, Captain. The kind that can't be found in manuals. Think about it. With a final nod, the general continued toward headquarters, leaving Rebecca to consider this new possibility. As she walked toward her car, Rebecca's thoughts drifted to the members of her team who hadn't lived to see this day. Major Callahan, whose jacket she wore. Specialist Rodriguez, whose family would finally learn part of the truth. Lieutenant Way and Sergeant Decker, who had made it home but succumbed to injuries and illness in the years since. She had carried their memories alone for so long, the sole custodian of their shared history. Now, at least some of that history would be preserved, acknowledged, and learned from. Not everything, some aspects of their operations would remain classified for decades to come, but enough that their service and sacrifices would no longer be completely hidden in redacted files and officially non-existent units. Rebecca reached her car and carefully placed her groceries in the trunk. As she closed it, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The woman who looked back at her stood straighter than she had in years, the restored patch and new citation gleaming in the morning sun. For the first time in decades, Rebecca Carter smiled a genuine expression that reached her eyes. She was no longer invisible, no longer caught between worlds. The classified operations would always be part of her, but they no longer defined the entirety of her existence. She had stepped out of the shadows, not completely into the light. Some shadows would always remain, but into a middle ground where her service could be acknowledged, where the next generation could learn from what she and her team had accomplished and sacrificed. The ghost in olive green had finally found her voice. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before a classroom of young officers at the Fort Braxton Advanced Training Center. The room was stark and functional, with white walls lined with maps and tactical diagrams. 24 lieutenants and captains sat at attention, notebooks ready, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and respect. Extraction operations under hostile conditions, Rebecca began, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, aren't about following a checklist. They're about making impossible decisions with incomplete information, while people's lives hang in the balance. She moved to the large tactical display at the front of the room, where a satellite image of desert terrain filled the screen. The location was deliberately obscured, but the terrain features would be familiar to anyone who had studied Middle Eastern operations. The textbook says you need air superiority, clear communication lines, and predetermined extraction points. She continued, reality says you work with what you have when everything goes wrong. A young captain raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you prioritize when multiple variables change simultaneously? Rebecca paused, remembering a similar question she had asked Major Callahan 23 years ago during her first classified briefing. The weight of his jacket, now cleaned and displayed in her apartment, seemed to press against her shoulders. You fall back on training, but more importantly, you fall back on your team, she answered. No one person can process all variables in a crisis. That's why trust and communication matter more than individual heroics. She clicked to the next slide, showing a simplified version of the tactical situation from Operation Sandstorm. All identifying details had been removed, but the core lessons remained. Your mission parameters can change in seconds. Weather, enemy movement, equipment failure, any combination can turn a routine extraction into a survival scenario. The question isn't whether things will go wrong, but how you'll adapt when they do. Lieutenant Morgan, who had first approached Rebecca in the commissary months ago, was among the students. She raised her hand. Ma'am, when do you make the call to abort versus pushing through? It was the question Rebecca had been waiting for, the one that cut to the heart of command responsibility. She thought of Major Callahan's final transmission, his calm voice ordering them not to come back for him. Sometimes, she said quietly, the decision isn't about success or failure. It's about ensuring that someone makes it home to tell the story and learn from it. Leadership means accepting that some missions require sacrifice to save others. The room fell silent, sensing they were hearing something beyond academic instruction. These young officers were getting glimpses into decisions that had shaped classified history. After the class, Rebecca walked across the base toward the memorial garden. a quiet area where plaques honored fallen soldiers. The afternoon sun filtered through oak trees, casting dappled shadows on the carefully maintained walkways. General Thompson was waiting for her at a bench near the newest section of the memorial. In his hands was a bronze plaque, still wrapped in protective cloth. "The ceremony is tomorrow," he said as she approached. "Rodriguez's daughter flew in this morning. She's having a difficult time processing everything." Rebecca sat beside him on the bench. 26 years of believing one story, then learning the truth was classified. "I can't imagine." "She wants to meet you," the general said. "She has questions about her father that only you can answer." "What can I tell her that won't violate classification?" "The truth about who he was as a soldier and a person. The classified details matter for operational security, but they don't define his character or his sacrifice." That evening, Rebecca met Maria Rodriguez at a quiet cafe off base. She was a young woman with her father's dark eyes and determined chin, working as a nurse in San Antonio. She had driven 12 hours to be here for the ceremony. "I brought something," Maria said, opening a small box. Inside was a faded photograph of a young soldier in dress blues, smiling confidently at the camera. This was the last picture he sent home before the training accident. Rebecca studied the photograph, seeing the young communications specialist she remembered. "He talked about you constantly," she said. "Carried your picture on every mission. He was so proud that you wanted to be a nurse." "Was he scared?" Maria asked suddenly. "When it happened, was he afraid?" Rebecca chose her words carefully. "Your father was one of the bravest people I ever served with. In that final moment, he was doing what he trained for, protecting his team and completing the mission. Fear wasn't what drove him. Duty was." They talked for 2 hours, Rebecca sharing stories about Specialist Rodriguez's humor, his dedication, his love for his family. She spoke about his professional competence and his role in operations she couldn't name, painting a picture of a soldier who had died as he lived, putting others first. The next morning, the memorial ceremony took place in the base chapel. General Thompson presided, with Rebecca in dress blues she hadn't worn in years. Maria sat in the front row, flanked by relatives who had traveled from across the country. Specialist Carlos Rodriguez died in service to his country. The general began, conducting operations that saved the lives of 32 personnel and prevented an international incident that could have led to war. His sacrifice exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. Rebecca stepped forward to present the Silver Star to Maria, the medal's ribbon gleaming in the chapel's soft light. "On behalf of your father's teammates and all those whose lives he saved," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "We thank you for his service and for carrying on his legacy of helping others." Maria accepted the medal with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for bringing him home," she whispered. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Lieutenant Davidson approached Rebecca. His demeanor was completely different. From their first encounter, respectful, professional, transformed by months of education and reflection. "Captain Carter," he said, coming to attention, "I wanted you to know that the sensitivity training you recommended has become mandatory for all junior officers. We've also implemented a base-wide program about recognizing and respecting veterans of all backgrounds." "Good," Rebecca replied. "How has it been received?" "Initially, some resistance. But after hearing your story and others like it, people understand why it matters. We've had several incidents where personnel recognized potentially classified veterans and handled the situations appropriately instead of making assumptions." Rebecca nodded, satisfied that something positive had come from her public exposure. "The goal isn't to identify classified operations, Lieutenant. It's to respect the service, whatever form it took." "Yes, ma'am. I understand it now." As the day ended, Rebecca found herself back in the Memorial Garden, standing before the new plaque honoring Specialist Rodriguez. The inscription was simple: in memory of those who served in operations that cannot be named, protecting freedoms that cannot be taken for granted. General Thompson joined her, both of them standing in comfortable silence before the memorial. "Any regrets about coming forward?" he asked. Rebecca considered the question. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, fighting bureaucratic battles. Alone, carrying secrets that isolated her from the world around her. Now she was teaching the next generation, helping families find closure, and seeing her team's sacrifice finally acknowledged. "No," she said firmly. "It's time these stories were told, at least the parts that can be shared. The training program is exceeding expectations," the general said. "We're getting requests from other branches to expand it. Your team's legacy will influence military operations for decades to come." Rebecca touched the memorial plaque gently, thinking of the 5 names that would never be carved in public monuments, whose families would never know the full truth of their service. "They deserve that much," she said quietly. "They deserve to be remembered for who they were and what they gave." As they walked back toward the main base, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed. The woman who had been mocked for wearing a faded jacket was now helping to shape military doctrine. The veteran who couldn't get her medical claims approved was now serving as an example of how the system could work when it functioned properly. But most importantly, the ghost who had carried her secrets alone for 23 years was finally at peace with both the silence and the speaking. 1 year later, Rebecca Carter stood at the podium in the Pentagon's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of senior military officials, veterans advocates, and policymakers. The room was filled with the kind of people who shaped military culture and veteran affairs at the highest levels. "The Classified Service Recognition Act," she began, reading from prepared remarks that had been carefully reviewed for security. "Clearance represents a fundamental shift in how we support veterans, whose service cannot be fully acknowledged due to national security requirements. The legislation, inspired by her case and others like it, created new pathways for classified veterans to receive medical care and benefits without compromising operational security. It had taken months of testimony, bureaucratic navigation, and congressional negotiation, but the bill was now heading to the president's desk. In the audience, General Thompson sat in the front row, wearing his dress blues and the satisfied expression of someone who had seen a long campaign reach successful conclusion. Beside him sat Maria Rodriguez, now working as an advocate for military families, and Lieutenant Morgan, recently promoted to captain and serving as the Pentagon liaison for the new training programs. "Too many veterans have fallen through the cracks," Rebecca continued, "not because their service wasn't valued, but because the very nature of that service made it impossible to document through traditional channels. This legislation ensures that national security and veteran care are not mutually exclusive priorities." After her presentation, Rebecca was approached by a familiar figure, Lieutenant Davidson, now wearing captain's bars and serving as an aide to the Secretary of Defense. "Captain Carter," he said, offering his hand, "congratulations on the legislation. It's going to help a lot of people." "Thank you, Captain Davidson," Rebecca replied, noting how much the young officer had matured. "How are things at the Pentagon?" "Challenging, but rewarding. I wanted you to know that the professional development program you helped design is being implemented Army-wide. The lessons about respect, assumptions, and hidden service are reaching thousands of officers." Rebecca nodded, pleased that the ripple effects continued to spread. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from our failures." "Yes, ma'am. I've made that a cornerstone of my leadership philosophy." As the event concluded, Rebecca walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the vast hallways lined with military history. The building represented power and tradition, the visible face of American military might. But Rebecca knew that some of the most important contributions to that power remained invisible, known only to a few. Outside, Washington, D.C. buzzed with its usual activity. Rebecca caught a taxi to Arlington National Cemetery, a pilgrimage she made whenever she was in the area. She walked through the rows of white headstones until she reached to Section 60, where newer casualties were buried. She stopped at a modest grave marker bearing the name Daniel Callahan and the dates of his service. The official cause of death was still listed as a training accident, but his family had finally been told that he died serving his country in classified operations. It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough. Rebecca placed a small American flag beside the headstone, a ritual she had performed every year since his death. But this time, she also left something else, a copy of the new legislation signed by the president that morning. "It's done, Daniel," she said quietly. "The next generation won't have to fight these battles alone." A gentle wind rustled the trees overhead, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the muted conversations of other visitors. Rebecca stood in silence for several minutes, feeling the weight of completed obligations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant now Captain Morgan. "New class starts Monday. 36 officers this time. Thank you for everything you've taught us." Rebecca smiled, typing back, "Teaching is learning. See you Monday." As she walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Rebecca's reflection caught in a memorial wall's polished surface. The woman looking back at her wore a crisp navy blazer with her medals properly displayed, the Presidential Unit Citation, the Silver Star, finally awarded, and several others that had taken decades to receive proper recognition. But on her lapel, she still wore a small pin bearing the faded outline of the Phantom Unit insignia. Some things were worth preserving exactly as they were worn, weathered, carrying the weight of memory and sacrifice. At the cemetery entrance, Rebecca paused to look back at the endless rows of white stones, each marking a life given in service. Most of these stories could be told openly, celebrated publicly, remembered completely. Others, like those of her teammates, would remain partially hidden in classified files and redacted reports. But they would be remembered. The legislation ensured that future veterans wouldn't disappear into bureaucratic limbo. The training programs ensured that military personnel would understand the complexity of service and sacrifice. The recognition ceremonies ensured that families would know their loved ones died as heroes, even if they couldn't know all the details. Rebecca's phone rang. General Thompson, calling with news about the next phase of the training program expansion. "Captain Carter." His voice was warm with satisfaction. "I hope you're ready for this to get bigger. We've got requests from NATO, allies who want to implement similar programs." "The lessons of service are universal, sir," Rebecca replied. "Different uniforms, same principles." "Exactly. Your team's legacy is going global." As Rebecca headed toward Union Station to catch her train back to Fort Braxton, she reflected on the journey from that morning in the commissary to this moment. The mockery and humiliation had transformed into recognition and purpose. The isolation had become connection. The silence had found its voice. She thought about the young officers she would teach on Monday, eager faces ready to learn about leadership, sacrifice, and the complexity of military service. Some of them would go on to lead classified operations of their own, making impossible decisions in unnamed places for reasons they might never be able to share. When that day came, they would understand that service wasn't about recognition or acknowledgement. It was about duty fulfilled, regardless of who knew or who remembered. But they would also know that their service mattered, that it would be honored, even if it couldn't be spoken. and that they would never be forgotten by those who understood the weight of necessary secrets. Rebecca Carter had spent 23 years as a ghost in Olive Green, carrying invisible burdens and fighting silent battles. Now she was something else entirely, a bridge between the shadows and the light, helping others navigate the space between classified service and public recognition. The woman who had once been mocked for wearing a faded jacket had become a guardian of hidden history and a teacher of future leaders. Her story had found its voice, and that voice would echo through military corridors for generations to come. As her train pulled away from Washington, Rebecca watched the nation's capital fade into the distance. Somewhere in the Pentagon, legislation bearing her influence was being implemented. Somewhere at Fort Braxton, young officers were studying scenarios based on her team's tactics. Somewhere in San Antonio, Maria Rodriguez was helping other military families navigate the system that had once failed them all. The ripples continued to spread, carrying the memory of 5 soldiers who had died in an operation that officially never happened, but whose legacy would shape military service for decades to come. Rebecca closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the train carry her toward home, toward the next class, toward whatever came next in a life that had finally found its purpose in the light. The ghost in Olive Green had become something more, a teacher, an advocate, a bridge between worlds. And in that transformation, the sacrifice of Phantom Unit had found its true meaning, not in the classified files that contained their story, but in the lives they would continue to touch and the lessons they would continue to teach. Major Daniel Callahan's jacket would never fade completely. Neither would the memory of what his team had given to serve something greater than themselves. The story was finally complete, but the legacy would continue forever. If you enjoyed this story of hidden valor and unexpected recognition, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. These are the moments that remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized, until someone with the wisdom to see beyond appearances gives them the honor they deserve. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character was revealed in an unexpected way? Share your story with our community.